The prison was quiet that morning, almost too quiet. The air was heavy with the smell of metal and soap, and the dull hum of footsteps echoed along the concrete hallways. Inside the medium security facility, every day felt the same. There was a rhythm to it. Wake-up call, head count, breakfast, work shifts, and lights out. Most inmates had grown used to the routine. They followed it without question, because the rules were clear and breaking them came with a price. But lately something was changing. The older officers could sense it in the air. Small things were slipping, rules bent here and there, inmates whispering a little too long in corners, jokes being made during inspections. It didn't seem serious at first, just little things that people brushed off, but those little things started to pile up. Among the inmates were a few who believed they were smarter than the system. They knew how to play by the rules when watched and bend them when no one was looking. They talked about how far they could go before someone stepped in. They wanted to test the line, not to break free, but to feel some control inside a place where freedom didn't exist. One of the guards was new, only a few months into the job. He was young, polite, and tried to treat everyone with respect. He believed kindness could go a long way, even here. At first, the inmates liked him. He didn't shout, didn't use harsh words. He'd greet them by name and even joke lightly to ease the tension. But a few saw his politeness as weakness. They started trying small tricks, asking for favors, delaying orders, seeing if he would let them slide. When he overlooked the first few things, they took note. It wasn't about breaking the law inside. It was about power. Power was rare in prison, and whoever had it, guard or inmate, was respected. The line between the two sides wasn't as strong as it looked. The senior officers noticed the small changes. One of them, a man who had worked there for over 15 years, spoke about it during the morning briefing. "The tension's growing," he said. "They're testing us. Don't let your guard down. One small favor today turns into big trouble tomorrow." Still, the atmosphere stayed calm on the surface. In the mess hall, laughter returned, cards were played, and stories were told. But behind the laughter were quiet plans. Some inmates had found ways to make their lives easier, trading small items, switching shifts, getting out of certain duties by pretending to help officers. It seemed harmless enough, but it was changing the balance of control. One afternoon, during the work shift in the laundry section, a disagreement broke out. Two inmates argued about who had control over the machines. It started with words, but there was something behind those words, a buildup of pride and hidden anger. The young guard tried to step in, his voice calm but uncertain. The older officers nearby watched closely, ready to move if needed. The fight didn't happen that day, but something in the way the inmates looked at each other made everyone uneasy. It wasn't about laundry. It was about who had the last word. The new officer tried to act like nothing happened, but that night he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, the looks, the smirks, the feeling that something was about to happen. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Some inmates would refuse to follow small orders, moving too slowly, talking back, pretending not to hear. The new officer would correct them gently, but his voice didn't carry the same weight as the others. Some of the older guards began to whisper that the place was losing its discipline. The warden, a calm and strict man, noticed a change in reports. Fewer incidents were being written down, even though he knew from experience that silence often meant officers were letting things slide. He called a meeting. "Order is not just about rules," he said. "It's about respect. If you lose one, the other follows." Meanwhile, life inside the cells carried on. The inmates who stayed out of trouble could feel the shift too. The ones who liked peace stayed quiet, avoiding eye contact, not wanting to get dragged into anything. But there were others, the bold ones, who started walking with their heads a little higher. They spoke louder, laughed harder, acted as if they were running the place. In the evenings, when the cells were locked, the noise didn't die right away. Whispers passed through the walls, stories about who challenged which officer and who got away with what. The older inmates shook their heads, knowing it wouldn't last long. They had seen this pattern before, people testing the limits, thinking they could outsmart authority, until things snapped back harder than before. One night, the young officer stayed late in the control room, reviewing camera feeds. He wanted to understand what he was missing. He saw small details, hand signals between inmates, subtle trades of items during yard time, glances exchanged during roll call. It was like watching a quiet storm gather strength. He realized the inmates weren't just breaking rules for fun. They were organizing, testing, and learning who they could manipulate. The next morning, he reported what he saw. The senior officer listened but told him not to overthink it. "These things happen," he said. "Don't give them too much attention or they'll think they've got power over you." But the young officer couldn't shake the feeling. He watched more closely during his rounds, noticed how certain inmates took longer routes, how others distracted him during checks. It was all small stuff, nothing worth writing up, but together it painted a bigger picture. The breaking point came quietly. During lunch hour, one of the inmates refused to return his tray. It was a small act, one that could have been ignored, but the tone in his voice made the room fall silent. The young officer told him to hand it over. The inmate stared back, waiting to see what he would do next. Everyone watched. It wasn't about the tray. It was a test of authority. The moment stretched. Then with a slow grin, the inmate handed it over. The officer took it, said nothing, and walked away. On the surface, it seemed like nothing happened, but everyone felt it. The balance had shifted again. Some of the inmates started whispering after that, saying things like, "He won't do anything. He's soft." From then on, the mood changed. The guards began to sense that the inmates were pushing limits more openly. The older officers stayed firm, but the tension in the air was thick. The warden ordered more random inspections, more checks, more supervision. But it wasn't enough to stop what was coming. A few weeks later, during a routine afternoon in the yard, the unease finally turned into something real. Two inmates started arguing loudly near the fence. Others gathered around, pretending to watch but really waiting. The young officer called out for them to back away. They didn't move. His voice rose, but the crowd stayed. That's when he realized the line wasn't just being tested anymore. It was being crossed. The senior officers rushed in within seconds, their voices sharp, commanding. The crowd broke apart, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. Everyone knew things had gone too far. The inmates looked tense, the guards alert. Nobody said it aloud, but the message was clear. Control had slipped, and getting it back wouldn't be easy. That night, the prison went on temporary lockdown. Inmates were ordered back to their cells earlier than usual. The officers walked the halls quietly, checking locks twice, listening for any sound. The young guard stood by the corridor window, staring at the dark yard. He could still hear the echoes of the shouting, the defiance in the air. He understood now that respect in this place wasn't given. It had to be earned and guarded every single day. One small mistake, one soft moment could open the door to chaos. He wasn't angry, just thoughtful. This was more than a job. It was a battle of patience, psychology, and presence. In the silence of that night, he made a promise to himself. He would learn from this. He would watch closer, stand firmer, and make sure that line was never crossed again. The prison lights dimmed as the clock struck midnight. The tension lingered, quiet but alive, like a warning waiting to unfold. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone knew that something had changed. The calm before the storm was over. The next few days after the yard incident felt heavy. Every sound echoed differently. Even the clang of the metal doors seemed sharper, as if the prison itself knew something had shifted. The officers were quieter than usual, watching every move. The inmates sensed the tension too. Everyone walked carefully, pretending everything was normal, but deep down, they knew it wasn't. The young officer kept thinking about that moment in the yard, the way the crowd refused to move, the way their silence felt like defiance. He hadn't seen anything like it before. He tried to convince himself it was just a misunderstanding, but he knew better. Something had changed, and no one was saying it aloud. The warden called for a special briefing. The officers gathered in the small meeting room, sitting around the metal table with their notepads and coffee cups. The warden stood at the front, calm but serious. "We've had too many small problems lately," he began. "Little acts of defiance, small signs of disrespect. That's how it starts. I don't want it spreading. Everyone needs to stay alert. Every rule, every order, make sure it's followed. No exceptions." The senior guards nodded. They had seen this kind of thing before. One small spark could grow fast if ignored. But the younger officers looked uneasy. They didn't want to push too hard and start another confrontation. It was a difficult balance, being firm without being cruel. Inside the cells, the talk was different. Some inmates laughed about what happened in the yard, saying the officers looked nervous. Others told them to keep quiet. warning that the guards were on edge. A few even whispered that the prison might go into lockdown again. The air was thick with rumors. One afternoon, during the meal shift, the young officer walked into the dining hall. The noise was louder than usual. Plates clinking, voices rising, chairs scraping across the floor. He could feel the tension the moment he stepped in. Some inmates stared at him longer than usual. Others looked away quickly, pretending not to notice him. As he moved between the tables, he saw one inmate passing something under the table to another. It looked like a folded note. The officer stopped and asked what it was. The inmate shrugged, pretending not to understand. The officer asked again, firmer this time. Slowly, the inmate handed over the small piece of paper. Days turned into weeks, but the tension inside the prison didn't fade. It only changed its shape. On the surface, things seemed calm again. The inmates followed their routines. The officers carried out their duties, and the warden acted as though everything was under control. But underneath, everyone could feel the unease growing like a quiet storm. The warden ordered a full investigation into the recent incidents. He wanted to know who had been stirring trouble and how far it had spread. A special internal team was brought in from another facility to review reports, question inmates, and study camera footage. The officers were told to cooperate fully. Nothing was to be hidden this time. The young officer, who had witnessed much of the unrest firsthand, was asked to give a detailed account. He sat in the small interview room, his hands resting on the table as the investigator questioned him. "When did you first notice things changing?" the man asked. The young officer thought for a moment. "It started small," he said. "A few jokes, delays in following orders, things that didn't seem important. But they added up. It was like they were testing us, just to see how far they could go before we reacted." The investigator nodded, writing quickly. "And how did the officers respond?" "Some ignored it. Others warned them, but no one wanted to push too hard. We thought keeping peace was better than making things worse. But I think that gave them confidence." The investigator paused and looked up. "Confidence to do what?" "To believe they were in control," the young officer said quietly. Those words stayed with him long after the interview ended. He realized how true they were. Somewhere along the way, the line between authority and control had blurred, and now both sides were struggling to regain balance. The investigation went on for days. Cameras were checked and every shift report was reviewed. The officers were interviewed one by one, and so were selected inmates. Some of the inmates spoke openly, saying they had nothing to hide. Others stayed silent, offering only small smiles or short answers. From the footage, the investigators noticed a pattern. The same few inmates were always nearby during small disruptions. The missing tray, the arguments, the late returns from the workshop. They weren't the ones yelling or causing scenes. They were in the background watching, whispering, steering others quietly. The warden was troubled when he saw the report. "So they were planning it," he said to his assistant. "Not one big act, but small ones, step by step." "Yes," the assistant replied. "They were building influence. They made others believe they could get away with breaking rules." The warden knew this wasn't just about punishment now. It was about control, respect, and the hidden human need for power. He had seen it before. Inside these walls, where freedom didn't exist, people found other ways to feel powerful. And when they lost that balance, the whole system shook. The next morning, the warden gathered his officers. "We've learned what happened," he said. "It wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern. Some inmates built their own order inside ours. That ends now. But we will do this the right way. With patience, not anger. We need to fix what we ignored." The officers nodded, though many looked tired. The young officer listened carefully, realizing that this was the moment that would decide how everything turned out. Later that week, the investigation team returned with the final findings. Several inmates were identified as the ones leading the quiet defiance. They hadn't committed major crimes inside, but they had created influence, pressuring others, trading favors, and spreading the idea that the rules didn't matter. The warden called each one in separately for questioning. Some denied everything, claiming it was all misunderstandings. Others didn't speak at all. A few even smiled, as if proud of what they had done. After the interviews, the warden sat alone in his office, staring at the reports. He knew he couldn't let this slide, but he also didn't want to make things worse by punishing everyone harshly. There had to be a lesson in this for the inmates and for the staff. He called the young officer to his office. "You've seen this from the start," he said. "Tell me what you think should be done." The officer hesitated. "We need to show that rules matter," he said. "But also, we can't treat them like enemies. If we do, they'll only push back harder. Maybe we should remind them what respect looks like from both sides." The warden nodded slowly. "You're learning quickly," he said. "Respect goes both ways. Fear lasts a moment, but respect keeps order." The next few days were filled with small but steady changes. The officers were instructed to follow every rule exactly, to report every violation no matter how small, and to treat every inmate with calm authority. There were no raised voices, no unnecessary punishments, just quiet firmness. At first, the inmates didn't know what to make of it. They expected anger, maybe even retaliation, but instead the officers were colder, more professional. Orders were given once, and those who didn't follow were calmly escorted away without drama. The calm made the inmates uneasy. The power games they had been playing suddenly lost their effect. Meanwhile, the investigation continued behind the scenes. Officers began to understand that this wasn't just about the inmates, it was also about them. Some had turned a blind eye, others had grown too relaxed. The system had weakened because everyone wanted peace instead of discipline. It was human, but it had a price. One of the senior guards admitted during a meeting, "We let things slide because we thought it was harmless, but we taught them the wrong lesson. We showed them that rules were flexible." The warden replied, "We can't undo the past, but we can rebuild what we lost. This isn't about control, it's about balance." As word spread about the investigation, the prison's atmosphere began to shift again. The talk inside the cells became quieter. The laughter faded. The ones who had once acted bold now walked carefully, unsure of what would happen next. The young officer noticed the change during his rounds. When he gave orders, inmates followed without delay. There was no more backtalk, no mocking smiles. Still, he didn't relax. He knew things could turn again if the officers lost focus. One evening, he found himself standing by the window in the control room, watching the courtyard below. The yard lights cast long shadows across the ground. A few inmates walked slowly in circles, talking quietly. He could tell from their body language that something had changed. The energy of defiance was gone, replaced by caution. He thought about how strange human nature could be. Even inside prison, where every movement was controlled, people still searched for ways to feel power. Some found it in rebellion, others in discipline. And sometimes both sides forgot that control wasn't the same as respect. The investigation finally ended after several weeks. The report was long, filled with observations and recommendations. It concluded that the problem hadn't been just the inmates, it had been the slow erosion of structure. The rules had loosened and small cracks had turned into gaps. When the report was shared with the staff, the warden spoke again. "This wasn't a failure," he said. "It was a warning. We saw what happens when order becomes routine instead of purpose. We can't just go through motions. We need to mean every action we take." That night, as the officers walked their final rounds, the facility felt different. The air was still tense, but there was a quiet understanding now. The inmates stayed calm, knowing the line had been redrawn. The officers stood straighter, their presence stronger but not harsh. The young officer felt something he hadn't felt since joining, the sense that balance might finally be returning. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the turning point. There were still questions left unanswered. How deep the influence had spread and whether everyone truly learned their lesson. He looked out into the dark hallway, listening to the faint sounds of keys and footsteps. The storm had quieted, but the air still carried the memory of what it had been. Somewhere inside those walls, the story wasn't over yet. The real test would come next, when the inmates realized the rules had changed for good, and the officers learned how to hold power without losing humanity. That would decide whether peace would last or whether another storm was waiting to rise again. The days after the investigation report were quiet but uneasy. The prison had changed. It looked the same from the outside, gray walls, metal gates, and the same strict routines. But the energy inside felt different. The officers were sharper now, more alert, and the inmates could sense it. The easy laughter that used to echo from the yard had disappeared. Everyone walked carefully, as if one wrong move could bring trouble. The warden knew the calm wouldn't last forever. The report had shown who had broken the rules, who had encouraged it, and who had looked away. It was time for consequences. But the warden didn't want chaos. He wanted order. He called a meeting with his senior officers. "We're not here to punish for the sake of punishment," he said. "We're here to rebuild discipline. Every action we take from now on will decide whether this place learns or repeats its mistakes." That same afternoon, the officers began quietly separating certain inmates from the rest. The ones who had been found leading others or manipulating small groups were called out by name and moved to a higher security block. There was no shouting, no arguments, just quiet faces and slow walks down the hall. The other inmates watched from behind the bars. Some whispered, others stayed silent. They knew what it meant. The message was clear. Those who tried to control things from the inside were no longer untouchable. The young officer was part of the escort team that moved the inmates. As he walked them through the corridor, he noticed how calm they seemed. There was no resistance, no anger, just a strange look in their eyes, like people who finally understood they had pushed too far. One of them glanced back at the cells they were leaving behind as if realizing it had all been for nothing. When the last one was moved, the halls felt lighter, but not everyone saw it that way. A few inmates started grumbling quietly. They said the officers had gone too far, that they were taking control through fear. Others just kept to themselves, avoiding any kind of attention. To prevent new problems, the warden introduced stricter routines. Extra roll calls were added, work shifts were shortened, and movement between areas was more controlled. The cafeteria, which used to buzz with conversation, now stayed mostly silent. Even small privileges like extended recreation time were temporarily stopped. The younger inmates struggled with the change. Some of them had looked up to the ones who were moved out, believing they were strong or brave. Now they didn't know what to believe. A quiet uncertainty filled the air. The young officer noticed it too. During his rounds, he saw the way people watched him. There was no mocking now, no small challenges or smirks, just quiet observation. He couldn't tell if it was respect or resentment. Maybe a mix of both. One evening, as he stood near the control desk, the senior officer approached him. "You're handling yourself better now," the older man said. "You've found your balance." The young officer nodded. "I just try to stay calm," he said. "But it still feels tense. Like something's waiting to happen." "That's normal," the senior officer replied. "When people lose what they think they control, they go quiet before they settle. It takes time." The next few weeks proved him right. Slowly, things began to shift again, but in a better direction. The inmates followed orders without argument. The officers no longer needed to raise their voices. The warden's new rules started to show results. There was structure again. The prison was regaining its rhythm. Still, the officers didn't let their guard down. They knew peace could turn quickly. They watched the cameras, read the reports, and made sure no small rebellion went unnoticed. The young officer started to notice something else too. A few inmates seemed different. Men who once kept to themselves were now volunteering for work shifts or helping clean common areas. It wasn't much, but it meant something. Maybe they realized that staying quiet and cooperating made life easier for everyone. One afternoon, he was assigned to oversee a workshop session. The inmates were repairing furniture for a local school program. It was a calm job, and for the first time in months, the atmosphere felt normal. A few men joked lightly among themselves. The officer listened from a distance, pretending not to, but it made him quietly hopeful. Maybe this was how things could be, disciplined but still human. Later during the break, one inmate approached him. "You run things fair," the man said softly. "You don't treat us like we're all the same." The young officer didn't know what to say at first. He simply nodded. "Everyone has a choice," he replied. "How you act decides how you're treated." The man smiled faintly and walked away. It was a small exchange, but it stayed with the officer. Respect, he realized, didn't have to come from fear. It could come from understanding. Still, not everyone felt that way. A few of the inmates who had been close to the ones moved away began to talk again in whispers. The officers picked up hints of frustration, especially among the younger ones who missed the sense of excitement that came with pushing limits. But now the guards were ready. They didn't ignore the signs anymore. Every suspicious act was noted. Every pattern was tracked. The warden made it clear. No more second chances. "Rules are here to protect everyone," he told the staff. Not just the officers. The inmates too. When we let small things slide, we hurt them as much as we hurt ourselves. Over time, something unexpected happened. The same inmates who once rebelled started warning the younger ones not to make the same mistakes. They had seen how quickly things could turn bad, how freedom could shrink even more when rules were ignored. One night, during head count, an older inmate quietly told the young officer, "We needed this." We got too comfortable. The officer didn't respond, but he understood exactly what he meant. Life inside began to find balance again. Work resumed, privileges slowly returned, and laughter cautiously found its way back into the air. The dining hall was quieter, but not from fear, just from focus. People ate, worked, and rested without trying to play games with authority. The warden watched this transformation carefully. He didn't smile often, but when he saw the progress, there was a sense of calm in his expression. He knew the peace was fragile, but it was real. He called the officers together for one final meeting about the incident. "We've restored order," he said, "but let's not forget what led us here. Power isn't about control. It's about balance. If we stay fair, they'll stay calm. If we grow careless again, we'll end up right back where we started." The young officer listened closely. Those words stuck in his mind. He realized that working in a place like this wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about understanding people. Everyone here, officers and inmates alike, was trying to survive in their own way. That night he walked through the corridor alone, the lights dim and the air still. He could hear the soft hum of the building, the sound of doors locking, water dripping, and distant murmurs from the cells. It wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't dangerous anymore either. It was something in between, something steady. He thought about how far things had come since that first day when the inmates began testing limits. The fights, the silence, the fear, it had all led to this moment of fragile calm. Maybe this was what real order looked like, not silence out of fear, but quiet built on mutual understanding. Outside, the night wind brushed against the walls. Inside, the young officer stood still, listening to the faint breathing of a prison learning to heal. The storm had passed, leaving behind lessons for everyone. Consequences had been faced, and for the first time in months it felt like everyone understood why. But deep down, he knew the work wasn't over. Respect wasn't something you earned once, it had to be maintained every day. And as he turned off the corridor lights and walked toward the exit, he promised himself that no matter what came next, he would remember this. Rules mattered, but people mattered more. Months had passed since the trouble in the prison had ended. On the surface, everything seemed normal again. The schedules ran on time, the officers followed their routines, and the inmates had gone back to their daily work. But underneath that calm, something had changed. Everyone, officers and inmates alike, had learned something about limits, respect, and control. The young officer had grown a lot since the early days. He no longer looked nervous walking through the corridors. His posture was steady, and the way he spoke carried quiet confidence. The older officers noticed it too. They saw how the inmates now listened when he spoke, not because they feared him, but because they respected him. Every morning, he made the same rounds. He checked the cells, greeted the workers, and talked briefly with the officers at each station. It was simple work, but it carried weight. In a place where small mistakes could lead to chaos, calm consistency was power. The warden had also changed his approach. He had become more present, walking the grounds more often instead of staying behind his office door. He wanted to see things for himself now. Whenever he crossed paths with the officers, he offered a few quiet words of advice, not as orders but as reminders. "Patience," he would say. "That's what keeps this place alive." One afternoon, the young officer was assigned to supervise the yard. The sun was high and a soft breeze moved through the open space. The inmates were scattered in small groups, some walking, some talking, others just sitting quietly. It looked peaceful, but he had learned long ago that peace could be deceiving. He kept his eyes on everything, watching patterns, small gestures, who talked to whom. It was part of the job now, reading the atmosphere before it changed. As he walked past a group playing cards, one of the older inmates looked up and nodded at him. It was a simple gesture, but it meant a lot. Later that day, the officer was called to the warden's office for a meeting. Inside, a few senior officers were already seated. The warden leaned forward, hands clasped. "We've been reviewing behavior reports," he said. "It seems the new routines are working. Fewer conflicts, fewer complaints." He paused, looking around the room. "But we can't grow careless. Discipline fades if it's not maintained. One of the officers asked, "Are we expecting trouble again?" The warden shook his head. "Not trouble, but pressure. People inside here, when things stay quiet too long, they start to test boundaries again. It's human nature." The young officer understood what he meant. He'd seen it before, how boredom could be as dangerous as anger. After the meeting, he returned to his post, thinking about what the warden had said. Over the next few days, he noticed small things. Nothing serious, just shifts in mood. A few arguments during meals, louder voices during recreation, a couple of ignored orders. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, but it was a sign. One evening, while checking the West Block, he overheard two inmates whispering. Their tone wasn't aggressive, but their words carried frustration. They were talking about how things had gotten too strict, how nobody had fun anymore. The young officer didn't interrupt. He just noted it mentally and moved on. He had learned that not every spark needed a hammer. Sometimes it just needed space to cool off. The next day, he asked the warden for permission to organize something different, a small event, maybe a sports day or a cleanup challenge, something to break the monotony but still keep control. The warden thought for a moment before agreeing. "If you think it helps them release tension in a good way, try it," he said. "But stay alert." The following week, the event was held. The inmates were divided into small teams for a simple competition. Nothing fancy, just organized movement, teamwork, and friendly challenge. The officers kept watch, but the mood was surprisingly positive. There was laughter, clapping, and for a short while the prison felt lighter. When it was over, the warden stood by the fence watching quietly. "Sometimes," he said to the young officer, "discipline doesn't only come from control. It comes from balance." That evening, as the inmates returned to their cells, there was a calm energy in the air. No arguments, no tension, just tired faces and quiet satisfaction. Later that night, when most of the building was asleep, the young officer stood by the main corridor, reflecting on how far things had come. He thought about the early days when fear ruled the halls, when officers didn't trust the inmates and inmates didn't trust the officers. Now, even though it wasn't perfect, there was a kind of unspoken understanding. He realized something important. Punishment alone hadn't fixed the place. What had really changed things was how people started treating each other, with fairness even inside walls built on rules. Weeks turned into months and new inmates came in. Some of them arrived with defiant attitudes, testing the boundaries like those before them. But this time they found a system that didn't crack easily. The old inmates set the tone, telling the newcomers, "Don't push it. It's not worth it here." That peer influence mattered more than any order. The culture of the prison had shifted quietly but deeply. The warden noticed it too. During his inspections, he often saw small signs: cleaner work areas, calmer voices, fewer complaints. One afternoon, he called the young officer into his office again. "You've done good work," the warden said. "When you first arrived, you were unsure. Now you're part of why this place runs smoothly." The officer smiled modestly. "I just tried to listen," he said. The warden nodded. "That's what leadership is, listening before acting. Remember that." Outside the office, life carried on as usual. The sound of footsteps, the buzz of the intercom, the faint clang of a gate closing. It was the rhythm of order. As months passed, stories about what had happened before, the time when inmates crossed the line, became lessons for newcomers. Officers used those stories during training. "This is what happens when rules are ignored," they'd say. "And this is what happens when respect returns." The young officer sometimes thought about those earlier days, the fear and confusion, the shouting in the halls, the restless eyes behind the bars. It all seemed far away now, like another lifetime, but he knew better than to forget. Places like this never stayed peaceful on their own. It took effort every single day. One rainy evening, he walked the outer yard with the senior officer beside him. The sound of rain tapping on metal filled the air. "Strange how quiet it is now," the senior officer said. "Quiet's good," the young one replied. The older man smiled faintly. "Yes, but never mistake quiet for peace. We earn peace one day at a time." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the rain fall. Beyond the fences, lightning flashed faintly in the distance. Inside, the prison lights flickered softly. Everything was secure. Before the shift ended, the young officer made one last round. He passed by the cells, checking the locks, exchanging brief nods with the inmates who were still awake. One of them said quietly, "You keep this place fair. That's why we stay in line." The officer didn't respond, but the words stayed with him long after he left the building that night. Fairness, that was the real reason peace had returned. Not fear, not punishment. Fairness. Years later, when he would look back, he would remember this period as the turning point. Not because of the reports or punishments, but because people learned something they had all forgotten. Respect can't be forced, it must be earned. The inmates who once caused the most trouble eventually finished their time. Some were transferred, some released. A few wrote letters later expressing unexpected gratitude. "You taught us that order doesn't have to mean cruelty," one wrote. The officer kept that letter tucked away in his drawer, a small reminder that even behind bars, change was possible. The warden retired soon after, leaving behind a calmer institution than the one he had inherited. His final speech was short. "This place is proof that people can learn even in the hardest circumstances. Never forget, authority without understanding is weakness." The young officer, now older and more seasoned, carried that lesson forward. He became known for his steady hand and calm tone, never shouting, never overreacting. When new officers joined, he told them stories, not to scare them, but to teach them. The worst thing that happened here wasn't the chaos, he'd say. It was forgetting that people, no matter who they are, need to feel heard. By then, the memory of when the inmates crossed the line had become something more than a story of conflict. It had become a reminder, a warning, and a lesson. Because in the end, everyone had faced consequences. Not just the inmates who broke rules, but the officers who had ignored warning signs, the system that had become too comfortable, and the structure that had forgotten empathy. But through those consequences came growth. As the sun set over the high walls one evening, the officer stood by the gate, watching the light fade. The clang of the final lock echoed softly. He took a deep breath, feeling a quiet sense of peace. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about balance, something fragile, something human. And as he walked away, he knew this truth deeply. Rules might hold a place together, but fairness keeps it standing.